Hello, all you beautiful bitches. I would like to welcome you right back here to the Sex, Drugs, and Motherfucking Jesus podcast. I have with me a delicious and nutritious man by the name of John M. I'm going to pronounce his name as Vanier because,
Vanier. I love that. That's
y'all,
so no one's ever done that. That's good. That's my name from now on. I love that.
he is the host of the Cult of Christianity podcast, and he is the author of a delicious and nutritious book titled the same. And everyone knows my history, my chaotic and turbulent history with the church. And so when I discovered this son of a bitch, I decided, hey,
Hi,
John,
hi, hi.
how you doing today?
I am doing great. Thank you so much for having me on. I love the title of your pod. I was laughing because I haven't had a ton of sex. I've only done a little bit of drugs, but boy, I've done a lot of Jesus. So I'm happy to be on.
Oh, the way Jesus is packaged by these churches makes him just as much of a narcotic as anything.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you've had all the drugs. And so, in your own words, tell us your history and everything before I open my cock holster and do it for you.
All right. Sounds great. Yeah, so I grew up very religious, very Christian. I had what you might call like a reformed upbringing, which is kind of a more conservative and formal version of evangelicalism. And my dad was in leadership in the church. Church was a part of life. We went to Sunday morning and evening service. We went, a couple times during the week. And so all my social life was at church. I was homeschooled. So church was kind of the world to me. Um, but I was always a pretty skeptical child. Things didn't quite add up to me. So it wasn't until age 11 where I officially converted after asking a lot of questions about how we could trust the Bible and what if we're all Christians. And so I was really good. Other than that, though, I was a goody two shoes, never did nothing wrong. But then after I converted to Christianity officially, I, yeah, decided to take it very seriously to the point where at 17 years old, I felt the call to be a pastor. And so started looking at college options, and there weren't a ton for undergrad. And so I was like, well, I want to get going now. I'm on fire now. Praise Jesus. So I wanted to go be a pastor, and I didn't want to have to wait 8 years to do it. And so I found a good, at the time, reputable college where I could study biblical exposition. So I went and got that degree. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Exposition with an interdisciplinary in literature, and got that, got married, got hitched. And by the time I graduated, I was a little burned out. I thought it was just normal ministry burn. And so I figured I'll take a little time off from this church stuff. I'll still go to church regularly. I was still a youth pastor. That's what taking time off looks like when you're a Christian, is just doing less but still being very active. And so then I went through a very, very messy divorce that kind of drove me into a downward spiral. Had a bit of a flirtatious dance with alcoholism, I like to say, where, you know, nothing really mattered anymore. And I was trying to reconcile all the problems I had had with Christianity my whole life that I just kept kind of putting on the back burner. And I got burned by the church. My ex-spouse got burned by the church as well through the process of our divorce. And I was like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if all of this is true. Fast forwarding through a lot of funny stories, you get to me living in a van, traveling with my cat across the country, where I started to write my book, The Cult of Christianity: How Churches Control, Contain, and Convert. Um, so I wrote that book, was expecting a lot of backlash, got some, but not as much as I was expecting, I suppose. So that was nice and refreshing. And then in early 2021, I was thinking of different ways to promote the book. And I was like, a lot of authors have podcasts to promote their books. So let me do it that way. And I was like, but, probably only 6 people will listen or whatever. It'll be nothing. And then the podcast did way better than the book did. And so I got to start interviewing people I was very interested in interviewing, including Christians. That's some of my favorite stuff to do, is get into interviews with Christians. And so that's kind of what I do now. And currently I'm between seasons, but it's really been rewarding to be able to talk about, from both my experience and my expertise, how Christianity, especially white American evangelicalism, functions as a cult. That's me.
Hallelujah, tabernacle, and praise. So we're going to dig deep into everything that you just said. I wanted to get into your podcast artwork, though.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's this huge guy standing either on a pedestal, a platform, or a chair or something like that, and then 3 minions surrounding him and bowing. And I couldn't tell, is that supposed to be God, or is that supposed to be the church or a preacher? What does his artwork mean to you?
Wow, this is fat. Nobody's ever asked me this. This is a great question. So I've gone through different iterations of artwork, have even consulted with other people to update the artwork because it's pretty old at this point, and I haven't been able to get away from it. And one of the main reasons is I love the nondescript nature of it. It's for your audience, it's basically clip art, and it looks, you can't tell if it's the gender, the race. You can't tell if it's God or if it's a preacher. And I like that because I think that's a lot of what goes on at church. Who is being worshipped? Who's the one bowing the knee? Who's the one on the pedestal? So every time I've tried to make the artwork more grabby or more interesting, I end up saying more with it than I mean to. But the 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 way I interpret it, and other people can interpret it other ways, is cults have hierarchies. There's always leaders and followers. There's always one person or several people on pedestals, and then other people just basically having to submit to their authority. And in any environment where that is demanded, I think it can qualify as a cult. My 3 alliterative words are control, containment, conversion. And so I hope that the art communicates, like, that's, if you were able to zoom out and take away all the social constructs, that's kind of what Christianity actually is.
Concur.
Yeah.
I appreciate the ambiguity of the huge figure. And I've said the same thing myself. And I've done this in the past, worship the pastors without really realizing it. I worship the building,
Mm.
the worship leaders, anybody up on a stage.
Yeah.
And I learned in my hypnotherapy training, when a person is on a stage, we subconsciously bow to them in a way, before we even realize it, just by virtue of them being on a stage. And we're not really as
Right.
critical of people as we should be just because they're on a stage.
Yeah.
So you said your Bible college was incredible at the time. Did they fall into some scandal or anything since you
Oh,
graduated?
a, a handful. It's Moody Bible Institute. You can just Google Moody Bible Institute controversy, Moody Bible Institute Title IX, Moody Bible Institute, you know, abuse, whatever. While I was there, I mean, about just while I was a student, there were about, I would say, at least 2 or 3 pretty, like, nationally recognizable scandals. The thing is, it's such a small school that people forget about it very quickly. The campus I went to doesn't even exist anymore. It's shut down. They only have one campus now in Chicago, and I believe they're struggling pretty hard. But yeah, what's funny though is the education I received at the secondary campus, I would say was shockingly solid. It was pretty good, but the culture was brutal. It was bad, toxic from the top down.
Lies, scandals, and deceptions.
Yeah, the
Oh,
fun stuff.
oh, so a scandalo. But you were pretty good. I read where you were one of 2 recipients of the Moody Bible Institute Homiletical
Yeah.
Jury Award for outstanding preaching in the year
Yes.
2018. So does that mean you can hoop and holler or what?
Yeah, I won preaching. So yeah, it was silly. It's so every graduating senior at Moody Bible Institute, I believe on both campuses, faces a homiletical jury. Homily just meaning sermons, the jury meaning people who judge you. And so you stand before, it's usually a panel, I think it's 4 judges, usually a preacher from the local community, the preaching prof, an administrator, and another professor. And yeah, I scored almost perfect on my sermon. So it was fun. But can you imagine anything more boring than a bunch of 22-year-olds preaching 30-minute sermons for 3 to 5 hours over 2 days and sitting through them and marking them on how good their gestures are, their use of visual aids, did I get the big idea of their sermon, that kind of thing. But apparently I was really good at it. So I don't know what that says about me, but
You preached for 3 or to 5 hours straight for 3 days?
oh, I just preached 30 minutes, but there was the students rotate through
Okay.
for hours. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm curious about, you just said, like, a few of the things that they critique you on. I
Mhm.
wanna know exactly how they analyze a sermon for quality, because this is my gripe I have with this new culture where these churches, they pre-write the sermon, they gotta get previewed by the board or whatever, before it's put out to the church. I feel like they're doing that so they can be sure they have certain keywords and phrases and everything so that they can effectively still mind fuck the congregation. To me, it feels like it's not as authentic, as how when you read, like, the Hebrew Bible and everything like that, when those people preached, they just got up and spoke. It was the same thing with the preachers who raised me. There was none of this, I need to write it down shit. And so
Yeah.
what rubric, what are they checking for?
Wow, this is a huge, I mean, this is worth a whole episode. I particularly enjoy deconstructing how sermons work because I think a lot of people don't even know the process, and there are a million different styles. So the camp I was trained in would be called Big Idea Preaching. There are literally books about different styles and structures of sermons, but the, I guess, philosophy or ministry style I was trained in is called Big Idea Preaching. Big Idea Preaching just means there's one big idea you're trying to get across throughout the whole sermon. It's you repeat one phrase. The sermon I won on the big idea was God lets us be lonely so that we will know he is our only, which, boy, is that a problematic statement. but but it won. And so many things. One, in the camp I'm trained in, you memorize your sermon, meaning you manuscript it, you type every single word you're going to say and you memorize it. You have no notes. And I'm very thankful for that because it makes you an effective speaker. But when I'm most cynical about my degree, I joke that I have a degree in TED Talks because that's kind of what sermons, at least in the more trendy churches, are now. Some of the more old school, if you're in a traditional Protestant church, you might hear 3-point sermons. That was very common. They'll usually have an alliteration or something like that, 3 C's or, 4 D's or whatever. Kind of a point by point sermon. That's pretty common. Most sermons are going to have basically like a 3-part structure, a hook, where you get people interested in listening to you. It could be a personal story or an anecdote from history or something like that. Then it's got the meat of the content that can look like reading through the Bible and commentary style, where you're just commenting on the verses as you're going through. Or it can be principles you've drawn out. This is where you would do word studies or talk about the original context. And then application, or why is this relevant, is usually the third part. In the style I was trained in that third part is where you relate it back to Jesus and the gospel story. So sermons are very ordered and structured now. in different eras of history, they have been different things. And even in the US, I mean, during the Great Awakening, they were very, fire and brimstone. We joke about that, but they were oftentimes off the top of the head and very impassioned. Different cultures worldwide have viewed sermons very differently. Sermons, in my opinion, didn't even really exist back in ancient Judaism. They were more storytellers, and so there might have been parables, but what we would think of now as a sermon, I don't think quite existed until probably the apostolic era. Probably, I don't even personally think Jesus preached sermons, which is not a popular belief, but I think he was just speaking and people were following him, and some of it got written down. So sermons mean different things to different people, but if we're talking about the word preach in Greek, I mean, it really just means proclaiming or talking. It's not a thing that a special person ordained by a committee, reviewed by peers, is supposed to speak about. It's not an academic thing, or at least it wasn't originally. So it's definitely turned into something quite different than it used to be.
What do you think about Joel Osteen? I
Love
bring
him.
Wait, I bring him up. I know I get the sarcasm in your tone.
Yeah.
I bring him up because that's the church that I was at before I got kicked out, and I talk
Mhm.
about I talk about Lakewood Church a lot because that's where my greatest church trauma happened at. Had it
Mhm.
been at Bonquisha's Church of God in Christ or Sally's Church of the Way,
Mhm.
then I would have
Right.
been talking about Bonquisha or Sally and not Joel Osteen. But that's just where the shit went down, and it just
Mhm.
happened to be the largest church in America. And but it's convenient for my task because since he does own the largest church in America, other churches look up to him and they try to emulate the things that they do. And that's why I like to dissect them all the time because you have a lot of people. There's people who even like stream and broadcast their service into like their gym or auditorium, and that is their service. At least
Right.
the case when I still went there. So their influence is global.
Mhm.
What do you what just tell me what you think about them.
So I have a probably the strangest ex-evangelical, non-Christian anymore relationship with Joel Osteen, in that everyone wants to talk about him, and they did when I was at Bible college too, like in a negative light. And he deserves a lot of it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, he's very like outwardly um almost unapologetically in it for the money. I mean, you don't have to be a super like analytical person to just look at his church and go, something doesn't add up here. The problem with him is he is a great scapegoat for more local churches and people who think they're better than Joel Osteen and they're not doing the exact same things that Joel Osteen does. He's a great scapegoat for them to say, yeah, you got to watch out for wolves in sheep's clothing, like Joel Osteen, instead of facing how they operate cults in very similar ways. So that's kind of the angle I come at it from. Don't get me wrong, everything negative anyone's ever said about Joel Osteen is probably true, but he does not scare me as much as the local churches do, primarily because local churches don't have a national audience. They're not under the same kind of microscope. They can get away with a lot more. So those are just my initial thoughts, but I'm happy to dig into more.
Dissect the preaching style. So when I was there, people used to, criticize him for being too happy. They would say people would jump up in the middle of the sermon and holler and stuff before security yanked their asses out of the building and stuff like that. I'd show up to church and there'd be protesters and everything like that. I thought all of that was a bit extreme,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I was like, I'm happy to hear something happy instead of the fire and the brimmy stony.
Yeah.
But since after I got kicked out of there, I went through so much bad stuff. The person I am now, like a message like his would be too like milky. Like it wouldn't sustain.
Right.
Like it doesn't really speak to deep shit.
Yeah, well, so it's kind of like the concept of toxic positivity, right? And in Christian circles they'll call it the prosperity gospel. So yeah, I think that's bad. I think it's bad not to be able to admit that life is tough and hard and like has bad things in it. And when you're unable to articulate that, it's suspicious. I because the background I came from was never positive and toxically cynical. Again, Joel Osteen doesn't trigger me as much. I'm like, oh, look, someone being a nice person who's a Christian, that's refreshing. So that's kind of what I think. But I will say, so I read Your Best Life Now, and I was in a culture that thought Joel Osteen was the devil. And so I always kind of was more charitable towards him than a lot of other people. But as far as the preaching style, he's a great speaker, and people who emulate him are going to be great speakers. Why? Because it's the same formula TED Talks do. You can watch a TED Talk and think it's the most amazing thing you've ever heard, and then you sit back for another 5 minutes and you're like, I have no idea what they actually said. Like I don't know if they said anything of value at all, or if they just have such a good speaking style that it was engaging, regardless of whether the material was actually relevant to anything. So I think the same thing goes on with Joel Osteen. I think it's nice to listen to him. It feels good. And then you sit back and you go, he didn't really say anything. Like nothing profound was said.
I concur. And y'all, when he says Your Best Life Now, he's talking about Joel's first book. And I read that one too. And I agree with you. I was like, and even as I was going to church there for all those years, it got to a point where the sermons started being repeated from time to time.
Right.
And then I would kind of be like, and especially now that I'm away from it, I'm like, the fuck did you really just say? But,
Nothing.
that's a part of the whole hypnosis aspect of it. By the
Mm-hmm.
time you're done with all the laser lights and the worship and the smoke fog and everything like that, your critical mind is blasted. Like you don't have
Yep.
any, you're just open to whatever the fuck is going to be said. And what you said about it being a formula, it's true. Like I see the same shit replicated in all the Osteens, the way they preach,
Mm-hmm.
be it the ones there at Lakewood or their extended family that have other churches in Texas and stuff like that. And the way they all crank out these books and everything, it finally clicked to me with them. I'm like, this is not, it's like so like rare and special. This is not necessarily God saying, thou shalt preach this or thou shalt write this book.
Right.
Bitch has got an ABC 1, 2, 3 algorithm, and you're just repeating the same shit over again.
Mm-hmm.
And then my problem is with that is that they don't share it to the whole world. Like they're only giving it to like their select few people.
Yeah. Well, any good business model, you don't give away all your content for free, right? And churches are no different. They claim everything is free, but it's not. It's an MLM. It's you know the and that comes, in my opinion, from their theological perspective, that all you need to have a good life is just believe Jesus was God. I mean, that's a crazy formula to assume, and it comes with a million asterisks, because you can believe Jesus is God, but then all of a sudden you have to serve in the church, you have to have these kind of sexual practices, you have to raise this kind of family. There's a lot of strings attached the further in you go.
Hallelujah, tabernacle, and praise. So I want to go back to this divorce. So
Sure.
how do you identify sexually?
Don't. No,
Okay.
I for the sake of my queer friends, I will say that I am cis het to society.
Cis head.
Cis het. As I'm a cisgender man, heterosexual. Sure. Yeah, we'll just go with that. Personally, my personal feelings about sexuality is everybody's on a spectrum. The labels are helpful sometimes, but for broad stroke purposes. But if you actually wanted to get to know me, a simple conversation with a simple label will never do the trick.
Oh, so I might get to have my way with you yet. Yeah.
Got to keep the hope alive.
Hercules, Hercules. And so
Yeah.
so I want to know just how nasty it got with this divorce. As I've talked to people, like I was kicked out because they found out I wasn't straight, and they were like, basically, you're a pedophile. We'll give you conversion therapy if you want it. Other than that, you can't stay. Uh,
Yeah.
so I've heard of churches treating people who get divorced the same way. Like, I don't think getting divorced is. I have a lot of opinions on that, but just tell me
Mhm.
what happened. I want to know just how nasty did they get.
Yeah, so I'll mention, there's obviously parts that I'll omit just out of respect for my ex-spouse. But what I will say is it came about suddenly. It wasn't directly related to any spiritual issues. We were both, I mean, we met at Bible college. So, there were expectations that went along with that I think both of us had expectations that changed as we got older, but had no tools to communicate them because we were so indoctrinated to do it a Christian way. But the Christian way did not fit what we wanted to be in our life. So, and I wish I was as mature as I am now I would never have been able to articulate that while it was happening. And I was a pretty bad husband. I do take 99, if not 100% of the responsibility for that marriage ending. But as far as how it related to the church, they wanted to be so involved and basically micromanage the process of us getting back together, which initially was both of our goals when we first separated. We didn't do a clean break, we were they had moved out and we were trying to, you know, figure out if there was a path forward. And we were, seeing a relationship coach. We were actually communicating better than we ever had. But the church was concerned that our relationship coach wasn't, a biblical counselor or whatever. And every time they would meet with us, which we met with them a lot, both the head pastor and associate pastor, it was like a very mob like or mafia like, where, well, what are you doing it this way? What, what kind of are you interested in our community? We would sometimes skip church, right? Because we were exhausted, because it was an exhausting time. And every time we skip church, they would say, even if it's too triggering for y'all to come to ours, you need to be going somewhere. You should never skip church, basically. And so it really hurt, because by this point, I had been burned by churches in big ways at least 2 times prior. And so this was definitely a final straw moment for me, because I knew what to expect and it happened. And it was just kind of like the two previous experiences had really led me to believe that churches can be really toxic, but they're not supposed to be. And this third one was kind of the what do they say in comedy? 2 is a suggestion, 3 confirms the pattern. It was a confirming the pattern that, oh, this is what churches do. This isn't like exception to the rule anymore. They make people feel like crap if they don't do things their way. And it hurt really bad. So that was all kind of vague. I can get into some more of the details, but in general, the idea was, if I did not follow a very specific path, I was not going to be welcome, regardless of the fact that I had more religious education than most of the congregation, regardless of the fact that I had been a pastoral intern and youth pastor with them, regardless of the fact that I had written some of their policies to protect their children because they had none, regardless of all this effort I had put in, it didn't matter. I was still under their control.
What do you think gives churches the this notion that they can poke their nose into people's personal lives? Why do you
They,
think?
they're they're divinely appointed to do so in their head. I mean, that's why they're there. God has put them there to watch over the flock. I mean, it's from top to bottom their mentality. There's leaders and followers at church. There always will be, because that's the structure that has come about. In Catholicism, it's stark, right? Like it's obvious. Like, you have the Pope, you have priests. It's a very, like, they'll even be like what clergy is supposed to be abstinent, depending on who you ask, but most would say are supposed to be abstinent. I mean, there's like these and dress differently. I mean, these are huge markers. The same thing's present in evangelicalism and Protestantism. It's just more secretive. It's not as out to the public. They dress different. They talk different. They look different. They eat different. They have different schedules. Everything is different between leaders and followers.
Because when I was and all of those activities reinforces the hypnosis and the mind suck.
Yeah.
Because it was that I was at Lakewood, they would bring me into the office and ask me if I had a girlfriend,
Yeah.
see who I'm dating.
Like it matters. Like, yeah.
Like, and that's a huge problem I have with Joel because when he gets on camera, he's all like, everyone's welcome, que sera,
Yeah.
sera. But then he has these policies going on behind closed door that are very discriminatory. Some people have even alleged possibly illegal, and stuff like that. And so it's just really like a trip. And so you said that you wrote policies to protect children, protect them from what?
Well, just like with any church, you should have policies about, relationships with youth ministers and kids and policies about, if you're going to do like any kind of field trips with kids, that kind of stuff. You should just have policies, things for parents to sign just to protect you legally. It's honestly as much to protect the church as anything else from lawsuits, but in my opinion, you should also just want to protect kids from abuse. And they just didn't have, I mean, they were a pretty young church plant and they just didn't have any. After I was pretty much shown the door at that church, I learned the policies they said they weren't going to use that I had written, they ended up using them anyways and plagiarizing and saying someone else had written them. Not the biggest crime anyone's ever done against me. So I'm like, I'm happy those policies are there. So it's fine. But yeah, I mean, it's just, it was kind of the toxicity of that environment.
Because I was wondering, because like when I signed up to volunteer in the kids department at Lakewood, they had like a clause on there saying specifically that they did not want any homosexuals serving around their children
Wow, that's specific. Dang.
because they hold they're the type of people who are like you're either straight or a pedophile, and
Wild.
that's just where they're at on that. There is no spectrum for them, and so when you said you wrote policies to protect children, I was wondering if it was that same sort of anti-LGBTQ thing.
No, no. I at my most evangelical and at my most bigoted, which I would say I was still bigoted, I still never believed in othering queer people. It never got in. That indoctrination never sat in there. It just didn't work. My best friend, she's trans, and we grew up in the same church together. Same church is actually when I changed churches in high school, her family did as well. And so when she, I even before she came out, like I wasn't super gung ho about being bigoted. I always thought Westboro was evil, even at my most evangelical. Like, that kind of vitriol hate I never understood. But I would still say, the bigoted things of like, it's not the best way to please God or some bullshit like that. But yeah, after she came out and I started reading more, I kind of took the opinion. I was like, even if it is a sin, which I probably did still think it was, I just was like, it just doesn't seem like that big of a deal. And it's also someone else's business. And it probably didn't help at the time that I had my own hatred towards my own sexuality. You know, even just like masturbating felt like, very shameful to me. So I probably thought it was all garbage. So like, who cares? Which is not necessarily the healthiest mindset. So no, by the time I was writing church policy, I was not like, yeah, and make sure they're not gay. That wasn't in my head at all.
Hallelujah, tabernacle and praise. What what for you do you feel like is the deepest religious or church trauma that you received from your time? I agree with you. It really, really sucks when you served at a church for a while and you have this history and stuff like that. And it all gets discarded right along with you because in their opinion, you have fallen from grace. You've done any, none of it matters. The years that I was at Lakewood and the 10 to 12 hours, the 10 to 12 hours that I was there every week and stuff like that, it's all great and we can't replace you. We can't do it without you until they find a blemish. Then suddenly, you know what? We have a new person coming in today and your services are like, are no longer needed.
Dang.
You're fired from everything. Goodbye. Unless, of course, you do our conversion therapy package. For me, it felt like a bad breakup,
It can, yeah.
terrible breakup. And it was like the end of a relationship. And that is my deepest church or religious trauma that I have ever experienced anywhere. So I'm wondering what it is for you.
Yeah, it's really hard to rank trauma, because it all kind of compounds and turns into the same. Because you know, even if it's not religious trauma, even if it's any kind of trauma, typically you're going to experience similar kinds of trauma throughout your life just based on your personality type, your ways of thinking, how you developed as a child, those kind of factors. So it's hard for me to just like pick like a silo like, oh, this one is the kicker. I like to talk about my first one, which is it's the very first chapter of my book. I talk about being I had written a letter to the pastor and elders at 16 years old at the church I was attending. And I felt that they were not treating the youth, the young adults and teenagers very well at that church. They weren't being very respectful towards youth, and they had different problematic teachings that I was identifying at 16 years old. And so when I had written this letter, they said, "Well, let's talk about it." And so they called me into the church into this horrible like boardroom meeting. And it really did like I don't know if you ever watched The Apprentice, I did. And like that kind of boardroom, it was just very daunting. And they it was three elders I knew the best and my parents and I. And I actually asked to do it alone. I was like, this is my deal. I wrote the letter. My parents don't need to be here. And so my parents asked if they'd uh, be comfortable with that. So so they asked my parents if it was okay if I faced them alone. They said yes. And they just ripped into me for like 2 to 3 hours. They called my long hair sinful. That was the big thing I took with me, which is why to this day I still have long hair. And they, said the way we dressed was like the world. They said we hugged the female youth too long, me and my best friend, and just all this crazy stuff. And it was the first time. And what was so crazy about it, they were using scripture so wrongly to justify all their shitty opinions. Like clearly, like no sane person knowing the context or what the verses even said themselves would use it. There's that verse that says, "Let no one despise you for your youth." They use that to say, and that means you shouldn't be worthy of despise. Like it literally communicates the opposite of that. And so that was the first moment. So I think I obviously experienced, in my opinion, probably worse trauma later related to churches. But I think that was the aha moment of, oh, even if I'm going to remain a Christian, I really need to pay attention to what they're actually saying and why they're saying it. So that's the one that sticks with me and probably is responsible for some of my current trust issues, my current anxieties, that kind of thing.
It's funny to me how when it's convenient, these preachers want to be like, "Hey, don't be like the world. Don't fuck with Beelzebub, and don't do all that." But when it comes time for something that is going to benefit them, then they want to be like the world. And so I see this when it comes time to the way they structure the church business models
Yeah.
when they pay out salaries and shit like that. When they organize the churches behind the scenes and form them as these like LLCs and shit like that, even though they don't
Mhm.
pay taxes and stuff like that. That's one of my biggest gripes against Lakewood because my friend Barry Bowen, who works for the Trinity Foundation in Texas, which investigates churches and stuff like that, did some digging and found out that Lakewood Church only has like one actual member on file. It's run by the whole family is on the board. It's just a bunch of Osteens making all the decisions. But which is a very like world-like thing. There's no voting happening. There's no congregational involvement in decisions and stuff like that. So on the one hand, it's like, hey, you all are a member, but not really. It's just like in word
Yeah.
and deed. So we're gonna pay everyone at church corporate salaries like the world. We're gonna go business model like the world. We're gonna structure our goddamn sermons like the motherfucking world. But we don't want y'all to hug too much because that would be too worldly and don't
Right.
drink, and for God's sakes, don't go to a gay bar because we can't have you looking like the world now, can we?
Yeah. Well, and again, notice that pattern. Who can look like the world and who can't? The leaders can look like the world. The followers cannot. The leaders, the same rules do not apply to both leaders and followers in church. And what's funny is they would teach with their words, they would say, because leaders are held to a higher standard. But time and time and again, we find they're held to a much lower standard than followers are.
These are the hypocrites that Jesus warned us about.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Jesus doesn't seem like he was that big of a fan of religious leaders. So,
no, he really wasn't though. And I want to give a shout out to my homeboy Stephen from the Book of Acts, who also threw all the shade at the religious leaders too. He got his ass stoned for it. But what a great honor that Jesus stood up from his position, seated at the right hand of God to receive him at his death. So I'm hashtag Team Stephen all the way. Fuck the preachers, fuck the Pope, fuck every goddamn body, but yay God. And so I'm going to switch gears now to particularly to your podcast. Up until now, we just kind of like been talking
yeah.
about you. So your podcast, A Call to Christianity. I want to read just some of the titles. I think the titles are just like really titillating.
Mhm.
Um, Conversion therapy, Catholicism and Protestantism. There's so much history between Catholicism and Protestantism because my friend Jeffrey Kranz runs a website called overviewbible.com. And he has these really colorful pictures that breaks down like the Bible and shit like that. And it's really super fantastic. And I cannot wait to have him on my show. But from him, I learned, originally like the Catholics had like, 73 books of the Bible and Protestants had like 66. And it was like this whole thing and shit
Mhm.
like that. And I really don't like the Catholic Church. Let's see, mental health too, narcissism, marketing, divorce, faith versus works, afterlife, and then religious freedom, which is one that I pulled a few questions from.
Okay.
So, um, so you talk about like what we've been lied to about, and I was happy to listen to your podcast and hear your own words echo some of my greatest gripes, bitches, moans, legitimate complaints against the church. And I don't know if they all meant well, if they were just trying to give us their versions of the truth so they didn't trust us to make up our own damn minds. But I think about how like when I was raised and they told me don't drink any alcohol at all because it's all terrible and bad. Don't do any drugs at all because they're all terrible and bad. Don't masturbate. Don't look at porn. Don't dance secular music. Don't go to the bar. And as I've gotten older, now I realize there's actually therapeutic uses for drugs. And the Lord said not to get drunk, but not to have it, not to not have any of it at all. So if you lied about this, then now I don't trust anything else you have to say.
Mhm.
And so what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, alcohol is the drug I have the most experience with. So, you know, in so Christianity, especially the American variety, has a really strange relationship with alcohol. There's certainly like subcultures, kind of like Baptist are the ones that come to mind that take a very anti-alcohol stance, which is odd since if what's reported about Jesus is to be believed, he definitely drank and enabled people to drink. So it's weird to be a complete teetotaler. But I would also guess that among Christian cultures, alcohol is probably the most abused drug among them because it's not seen as taboo in the US as some of the other drugs. So either way, in my opinion, with alcohol, it's kind of one of those things where if they're prohibiting it, it's for the sake of their control. If they're abusing it, it's for the sake of control or containment or coping with what they're dealing with. So to me, it always will just go back to the controlling, containment, and conversion. So yeah, as far as like how they present that and lie and make it, either add rules that aren't present in scripture or early Christianity. So my perspective probably goes like this. I think Jesus was the first to reduce a lot of rules, and then ever since him, every Christian has added rules. I think Paul added rules. I think actually most of the apostles added rules personally. I think that a lot of the early church was trying to figure out what it was like to not have as many rules as the previous versions of Judaism. I think that Constantine made all these religious rules now have a relationship with the state and with governments. I think after the East-West Schism, there were, the East Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church had arguments about how you interpreted the Nicene Creed and created more rules out of one creed. I mean, it snowballs to the point where you're in the United States and your average church is just going to say things that don't have a source in the Bible, that don't have a source in historical understandings of Judaism, that don't have historical understandings of what's reported about Jesus. So the lies, whether they're intentional or not, don't really matter. It's so distant, it's hard to even comprehend or trust much of any of it, in my opinion.
And you were saying, like, on this particular episode about religious freedoms, how you feel like the religious freedoms most often protect like already established religions as
Yeah.
opposed to individual people's religious freedoms. And you give a really nice history of how there used to be all these Christian mandates at different states, and they used to have to recite belief in the Trinity or stuff like that. I think like in
Mhm.
Massachusetts. So speak to us about how the religious freedom in this country is really more for organized religion and not the person.
Well, it's not very much freedom or religion, right? Like it's it's politics more or less. I mean, freedom, the word freedom means very little in Christianity across the board, in my opinion. I The only freedom that I ever resonated with was this idea of freedom in Christ, and now looking back, I'm not sure how much I even resonated with that idea. There's this whole problem of free will of like, does God control everything, or are we just kind of robots following a script, or are we just doing whatever we want and God judges us based on it? I mean, it's very confusing when you start getting into the idea of freedom in Christianity specifically. But true religious freedom would look like I can practice my religion in any way that doesn't harm others or myself. That's pretty simple. I don't know what that has to do with abortion. I don't know what that has to do with marriage. I don't understand what the disconnect is there from a rational perspective. I really didn't understand it that much when I was a Christian. Even when I thought that gay marriage was sinful, whatever I thought that meant, I thought it should be legal because it didn't make any sense, right? It's like, well, marriage is a legal process in the country. It's the same word, but it clearly means something different to Christians than it does to non-Christians. So why should we be regulating what other people do? Again, that controlling, that cult-like mentality of thing, everyone needs to do it our way or get out. That's present in this idea of religious freedom, which really, again, it's just It's just it's just a lie. I mean, it really just means Christian exceptionalism. I mean, that's probably the best term for what it's actually describing.
Hallelujah, tabernacle, and praise. And you also were saying like how the religious rules, the people, and now this is all white men making up all these rules and shit like that. One of my biggest gripes is that when all this shit was done, when King James, who, according to the book of queer documentary on the Discovery Channel, King James himself, the author of the King James Bible, was a big old queer honey. If you haven't seen it, you need to watch it. You know, all these people, these are all just like white homies. They didn't have women at the table. They didn't have indigenous people at the table. They didn't have other races, and certainly not black people. Not in this country. We were only three-fourths of a person, for fuck's sake, you know, for so long. They didn't give a shit about what any of us had to say. And so it is impossible that the Bible was interpreted, translated, and put together and all of this with everybody in mind. This was written
Right.
white perspective, you know, sounds about white. Let me see here.
Mhm.
So you said that, you know, the religious rules were designed though by some white man who had some goddamn sense, because not every white boy is a fucking fool. You actually have some good
We mostly are, though.
I
Just to be
wa
very clear,
I wasn't gonna
we're
say
mostly fools.
I wasn't gonna say it. And so that you were saying like the few good white men actually put these religious rules in place to protect the church from hurting people. You were saying it really didn't originate from within the church. The church had their own way. They would have spun out all willy nilly. So
Yeah.
talk about how the rules are really designed to stop the church from becoming a monster, even though it did anyway.
Yes. You're talking about some of the founding fathers at the beginning of the yeah. So the so first off, not only were they white guys, they were white young guys, the worst kind. You know, at the founding of our country, and like there was so much religious tension at the founding of our almost never hear this, but like it's you don't have to look far, you can just read what these guys wrote. They like some of them thought Christianity was the worst thing that has ever happened in history, and wrote explicitly saying that. I mean, I'm paraphrasing slightly, I might be paraphrasing in a nicer way than what they were saying. And then there were some who thought it should be a theocracy straight up. Puritans very much had this mentality that we just need to be completely different from the Church of England. That's what we need to be. And then you had, you know, like you had clashing of cultures at the beginning. That state to state, the religious culture was different in the original 13 colonies. You know, the North was much more, well, I'll start with the South. The South was much more like Calvinist and like formal. The middle colonies had much more of this kind of Quakerist like approach to spirituality. And then the North was creating something new entirely. I mean, we've always been divided. There's never been like a Christian nationalist foundation. There's never been a Christian nation in that sense. And there's also never been like a completely anti-religion vein through what was written. History's complicated, and sometimes we're just too dumb or too lazy to actually take a look and read about all the different things that are going on in an era and just read what the winners said. And that's really irresponsible, in my opinion. So, yes, there were some rules that were trying to protect people. The First Amendment was never supposed to be churches can do whatever they want. It was always supposed to be we'll keep the church under the law. As long as the church understands they are not above the law, they can do whatever they want. That was what the First Amendment was supposed to be. Now it means churches are above the law. They can have those tax exemptions. They can abuse people and deal with it internally, unlike businesses or other organizations. They can exempt themselves from Title IX stuff, which is what protects people from being sexually abused on college campuses. They can exempt themselves from that. This is the kind of craziness we're dealing with now. And you can only do that if you're master manipulators who are the largest cult that's ever existed.
Goddamn. Okay, so
In my opinion, I should always say that just after everything I say.
child, it is what it is. You know, I pray for people to take their own look at stuff And it's hard because, people are raised as kids into this cult, you
Yep.
know, and so trying to unmindfuck somebody, as bad as it is, I thank God for all of the knowledge that's also available because it's
Yeah.
not like you have to go dig up a thick ass concordance like what I had when I was in, learning and shit.
Right.
You can like Google shit, you can watch documentaries, you can listen to podcasts. There's so many books
Hmm.
about the fuckery of the church. And so a person is only going to stay ignorant if they kind of want to stay ignorant in this day
Yeah.
and time. So it's like the worse it gets, I feel like God is also still giving us a way out of it or a reprieve, to some
Yeah.
degree. Well,
I agree. I would say the unfortunate thing about the information age, it is great. It is great that you can access. I'm partial to books. I think articles are fine, but really to get to know history, especially read a whole book. But I will say what's unfortunate about that is as equal to the truth as we have in the information age, just as much propaganda is out there. And Christians are propaganda making machines. They've been doing it for a long time. They're better at it than anybody. So I want to hope, oh, with all this information, a kid who's struggling with church will be able to, watch a TikTok video, go down an internet rabbit hole and find out all this good stuff. The problem is they can also go down a rabbit hole and become a school shooter. They can go down a rabbit hole and become a Christian nationalist just as easy. So that's quite frightening to me.
so true, so true. Well, people better get close to God and gain spiritual understanding. You
Yeah.
know, that way you can have some discernment about what it is that's being presented to you and be able to detect whether or not it's good or bad.
Discernment's very important, spiritual or not. But yes, having a discerning mind, and I'm not anti-spiritual personally, so I think there's definitely a route that of spirituality that can be very positive and good for both your own soul and for other people.
Shall I throw a touch of shade?
Do it.
I'm just going to say, and I'm talking about Paula White
Mhm.
and again Joel Osteen, just because why not? I just think it's really, really fucked up when as separated as church and state is supposed to be, you see people like Paula White hanging out with Donald Trump. You know, of course, he was surrounded by evangelicals anyway. And it just really bugs me. I got kicked out of Lakewood for hanging out in Montrose in the gay district, when I wasn't at church. And then Joel Osteen is on stage with Kanye West, you know, who is the last time I checked isn't exactly like you want your kids to grow up and be like that guy, you know,
Man, he went off the rails. Holy cow.
which time?
Yeah, exactly.
You mean when he was on stage with Joel or some just in general?
He is just off the yeah, I mean just post Trump era, just post Trump era Kanye. I mean, he's always been a little bit narcissistic and crazy, but like man, he really took it to 11 after that.
And so it just baffles me, but I guess it doesn't because we don't really know these preachers. We just know the face
Right.
they put on when they're in front of the camera. We don't really know them motherfuckers. For you to think that it is of high moral ground to break bread with Kanye West on stage, you know, I don't get that. And then to be
No.
like, Donald Trump is the greatest person. He's the savior of God. He's sent. I don't get this.
Yeah, I unfortunately I feel like I do get it. I feel like it fits perfectly only because from my understanding of the development of Christianity, it narcissists are rewarded. I mean, that's just what it does. It rewards narcissism. And so yes, I think it's very sad and upsetting when Jesus who might have been I'm really going to say something controversial. Jesus who was probably queer himself would have definitely spent more time with in a gay community than he would have with a president. I mean, I think it would be crazy to characterize Jesus any other way.
That do be facts though, because when he was here, he did hang out with the unpopular people. It was him who defended the town whore. It was him hanging out.
The majority of Christians, even after Jesus died, for the first 100 years, were prostitutes, criminals, and tax collectors, the outcasts of society. Those for the first 100 years, and probably a little bit after that, but definitely those first 100. That's who wanted to be Christians. There was a version of Judaism that now accepted those people, whereas before there was a version of Judaism that would never accept those kinds of people.
So you're saying you believe like Paula White, Joel Osteen, and a lot of these religious people are straight up narcissists.
Well, you have to be in right. I mean, to have the kind of image they do. I mean, I find I have to fight narcissism with a small podcast, right? Like, I can't imagine having that many people looking at you. You said something earlier where you said we see these preachers, but we don't really know who they are. I don't think they know who they are because the religion messes with your head. When I was just preaching to a youth group or getting paid to, go across state lines to give a sermon or whatever, I didn't have time for introspection. I was a narcissist as much as anyone. It's part of why I was such a bad husband. You get in your head about these things automatically. It's a toxic system from the top down, and no one is exempt from the horrible mindsets it can instill in you.
Give me more of this. Give me an example of a narcissistic thought, a narcissistic thing that you did and you feel like is common among preachers.
Well, yeah, it's harder to think. It's not like a thought, it's like your okay, so this is gonna might be long-winded, so I apologize if it is. If you narcissism is primarily bred when it's not like an actual mental disorder, but when it comes about later in life, is primarily bred from an apathetic mindset, meaning you don't care about anything. When you don't care about anything, the only thing that grounds you to reality is yourself. That's it. That's all you've got because you have to live in your body. You have to wake up. You have to go to sleep. You have to eat. You have to do these things. So the only real reality is yourself. So it rather than having thoughts, people treat the word narcissism like it just means like abusing people or something. Narcissism's unfortunately way deeper rooted than that. It's an inability to get outside yourself. In the way it ends up coming out in a more sociopathic way, meaning you don't care about right or wrong, you end up just living your life devoid of taking into account other people's feelings. So for me, one of the biggest regrets of my life is how when I was married, I just did not give a shit about my spouse's feelings. I just didn't care. My feelings mattered more than theirs. It wasn't like a conscious decision where I was like, woke up and was like, well, what I want matters and what they want doesn't. That wasn't my mentality. It was bred in. It was a state of mind where I would want to do something that they would want to do something else. And I won because I cared more about what I wanted to do than what they wanted to do. It applies in church culture too. Pastors, you see it all the time. As a pastoral intern, I had another pastoral intern with me. We had a great idea for a homeless ministry that would have been so great. It was basically like make little. I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time, huge homeless community. I was like, why don't we make little kits, like just protein bars, socks, like just something to lift their day. We can get the whole church together to put together these boxes and then distribute them. Then we're meeting people and we're serving people, and it's great, and everyone's involved, and it's cool. The pastor was resistant to it for bullshit reasons. What size socks would we get? Would we be competing with other homeless ministries in the area? What are we talking about at this point? And so it ended up not coming to fruition because I think two things. One, I think he thought his thoughts were more valuable than ours. And two, I think he was scared because if I'm able to do ministry better than he is, that's a threat, and I don't think he was like the most narcissistic person I've ever met in my life. I just think it's bred into the culture.
A preacher is going to be either really, really, really strong or really, 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 really weak.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's just the way it is. The problem is you can't just look at them and tell on which side of the fence they're falling.
Right.
you will rarely ever hear a preacher say they're sorry about anything. And when they
without a million caveats, at least.
at least a million, and when they change their I hear them say some shit like this when they find out they've been wrong about something. They'll say like, "I don't preach that the way I used to," or my thinking is evolving. So basically, bitch, you saying you were wrong, and then so you're not gonna apologize to the people who you misinformed for the past years before your mind changed. Nope.
Well, and even if they do, this is where the narcissism comes in. Even if there is apology, the apology isn't about the people hurt. The apology is about them and their growth. And, how, when I was a young preacher, when I was preaching at 24, I was wrong about this, this, and this. But now listen to how great I am. Like you're saying, who cares about all those people he hurt? It's about him or she now. Be progressive. There's evil women pastors now too. Gotta be gotta be progressive now.
Yeah, you're right. They have a lot of I statements and stuff like that, and they don't care. And it's in the book of Jeremiah, I think 21, and where the Lord has a gripe against these preachers who scatter his sheep and his flock, and they don't turn around and go and look for them. And all of us who've been kicked out, discarded, and everything like that. Like when I got kicked out, no one called, no one wrote, no one did anything.
Right.
I don't know if I was just classified as a heretic and just gone, but I mean, the preacher's supposed to put a concerted effort into getting anybody who they lose instead of just trudging along, trucking along and just writing more books and selling out more arenas and getting more money. Fuck a next book, bitch. You lost a member. You're supposed to stop
Yeah.
everything to go and find them.
Yeah, that mentality has honestly never been as long as churches have existed, that's never been the attitude of church leadership. Even if it was supposedly commanded by Jesus, it's never been present in history.
Oh, well, shit. So then the last thing that we're going to talk about, but we're going to have you back on to really dig into your book. Um, because I really want to focus on this particular podcast episode on religious discrimination.
Mhm.
Um, you said religious discrimination is a lighter form of religious persecution. And in this portion of it, you were talking about the death of Socrates, the death of Jesus, and the persecution of the Jews.
Yeah.
Go right ahead, say what you got to say.
So from the beginning, it built into Christianity is I mean it's in the term Messiah complex, right? This idea of the world is out to get you, and the most noble thing you can do is just sit there and take it, and God will reward you later, maybe, or maybe people will talk about you and you'll be legendary. Messiah complex and martyrdom complex are basically the same thing, and they both have like Christian roots. Messiah complex meaning what Jesus did when he, claimed to be Messiah and felt he was fulfilling his role when he was crucified. And then martyrdom complex is this mythology of all these great martyrs that supposedly existed in the early church who were burned at stakes, fed to lions, all that. Maybe one or two, maybe. It was done by mobs. It wasn't commanded by emperors. And primarily it was Jewish folk who this is where it gets complicated. Christianity was Judaism at first. Like that's what it was. The apostles are Jews. Jesus was Jewish. Sometimes I feel like I'm going insane and just a broken record pounding on like a podium just saying Jesus was Jewish over and over again. That's just I feel like people just can't admit it, or like they just shrug when I say it, like, well, I guess that's true, but I'm like, no, not but that's an important point. The where ancient Greek thought merged with Judaism, and you had Christians who were Greeks who thought Jesus was God, and then you had Jews who thought Jesus was a Messiah, and them both saying, well, why don't we all just get along? That's basically what exploded Christianity. The idea that it exploded under this persecution and some sort of spiritual force was at work that just moved people to, you know, love Jesus so much, and that's why Christianity still exists. It's entirely fiction. And what's really problematic about that is now Christians think they're persecuted when someone says happy holidays to them. They think they're persecuted when a Democrat wins the election. They have a mentality where if something doesn't go my way, it's because God is allowing Satan to persecute me, so I'll love him more, or some nonsensical idea like that. And it's probably the biggest, in my opinion, thread throughout the history of Christianity that has played into the most horrendous behaviors committed by that group.
Well, I'll say for the last time, Hallelujah Tabernacle.
The problem is anytime I finish saying something, it's never like an uplifting, positive message. It's always like, well, that sucks.
But it's the truth though, man, and it just I need to give it time to settle in so I can
Yeah,
just digest that shit. It's hard for me to imagine there's people who don't understand that Jesus was like a Jew,
yeah,
but then again, you have people in this country twirling the Hebrew Bible around, telling Jews to go back to their country. I'm all like,
right.
I often refer to it as the Hebrew Bible. I'm at the point that I'm going to stop calling God God and start calling him Yahweh
That's
because
what I started doing that in college, actually. It's very funny.
he basically kind of got, I don't know if I would say whitewashed with that term, but I didn't have a problem with it. But now that it's being used in such a negative way, I
Yeah,
want to, I'm all for, interpretations and evolution of schools of thought so people can grasp shit better
sure.
because Aramaic and Greek and Hebrew would have been kind of hard, I think, for the majority of the world's population to learn. But
Yeah.
since because it's taking this negative turn, I find myself wanting to detach myself from whatever popular Christianity is. So I don't call myself a Christian anymore.
Hmm.
I'm a believer in God, in the
Yep.
Trinity, and just simple shit. And I'm gonna start calling God Yahweh, and just be done with it.
Yeah. I think that's a good direction to go. No, honestly, I mean, it's good to use the actual terms instead of terms that were, the word church comes from a German word, Kirk. I mean, that's how young that word is. So we use these terms all the time, assuming this is what has always been talked about from the New Testament. It's just not true. It's just things develop and evolve in a sociological way. And one of the things I always say is like, you cannot understand theology if you do not understand sociology. There is no such thing as studying God without studying the history of what people have studied about God.
Hmm. That's smart shit right there. And I also always like to remind people that it is the Hebrew Bible. It is a Middle Eastern text. So
Yep.
this whole fight across the world, but especially in this country here over what God wants and doesn't want, it's like it's like they're trying to make us all act like Hebrews, and not everybody's supposed to do that. Yeah, I believe in God, but
Right.
I'm no fool. Not everybody's going to be a Christian,
Right.
and so um but trying to force people to act like Hebrews did 2,000 years ago with some of this rhetoric is just insane to me. So I want to read just a blurb from the book, even though we'll talk about it on the next episode because I thought the shit was funny. So he says, so y'all, John says at the top of his book, he says, the content will be confrontational. Therefore, for my own stress relief, as well as the readers, there will be intermittent tomfoolery.
Absolutely.
I thought that the use of the word tomfoolery in a well researched work was just spot on. And then he also says the claim that they are in a relationship with Christ, that their churches are their families. He's talking about preachers, that they love sinners but hate sin, or he's talking about Christians in general, actually, that they love sinners but hate sin, and that divine beauty is interwoven through all of it. Cool story, bro. Doesn't mean you're in a cult.
Feisty. Man, I was feisty when I wrote that. Yeah, it is true. They'll say some nice stuff, and yeah, sometimes yes, I think there's a time and a place for very intellectual deconstruction of the history, the beliefs and behaviors, and then I think there's a time to just laugh and just say this is so silly. Aren't humans so silly that they think things are important that simply aren't?
So I'm gonna let you have the last word. Say whatever the fuck you want to say. I want you to make it clear for us though, and exactly where you stand on God. I know you don't go to churches anymore. You don't fucks with religion. Do you still believe in them? Do you not? And then after that, you can give your advice, whatever the fuck you want to say.
Awesome. Everybody is always so curious about this, and it's probably just shows I never answer the question well because people keep asking, and I'm like, I don't know. So, okay, what do I want to say? I will say my gut, not my belief. My gut is there something rather than nothing. That's it. That's it. That as far as believies go, that's what I've got. As far as advice, just just stop reading Twitter and read a book. I know that's like I know that's like such boring grandpa advice, but it's true. I'm like I get really discouraged that people don't read books. You don't have to read a lot of books, just like a couple books would be great. It's just as it's the same thing as reading Twitter. It's just reading from a page or from a Kindle or whatever. You know, just read. Read more. Read. That's the only advice I got. And yeah, you can read things I disagree with. That's great too. Just read things. And please just don't, whatever you do, if you are going to read, don't just read what Christians say. Don't just read the Bible and what Christians say about the Bible. Read other stuff. There's other good stuff too.
Hallelujah, tabernacle, and praise. Thank you so much for coming on this show, John. It's been great. I look forward to having you a second time.
Yeah, of course, anytime.
Thank you all so much for taking time to listen to the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast. It really means everything to me. Look, if you love the show, you can find more information and resources at sexdrugsandjesus.com or wherever you listen to your podcast. Feel free to reach out to me directly at Verner at sexdrugsandjesus.com and on Twitter and Facebook as well. My name is Verner. It's been wonderful being your host today. And just remember that everything is going to be all right.